Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Across the World. Coming to you from America, I'm Tim Jones, and I am very old. But someone who's much younger and handsomer than I is my friend 12 time zones away in Lahore, Pakistan. Good evening, Hamad. How are you?
Good morning, Tim, and thank you for the compliment you have passed to me. And what we have for today's session?
Well, today we're going to continue our discussion from a previous episode when recently we talked about one of the most important wars in American history, and that was the War for Independence, also known as the Revolutionary War. Today we're going to talk about the other, perhaps equally important war in American history, and that is the American Civil War. And I'll explain what that was and why that was an important war. And we all know that war is bad, but there are some wars that sometimes have to be fought, unfortunately. And as we'll discuss, this war, the Civil War, was one of those wars that was probably inevitable and had to happen in our country.
A very nice topic, I think so. And as a Pakistani, I will enjoy to know about some history about the Americans.
Sure. So, do you have any questions you'd like to ask?
My first question from you is a basic question: that what was the Civil War about, and what did exactly happen there?
Sure. Well, our country has a history of being sort of divided between people who are more conservative and some people who are more liberal in their views. And in the 1840s and 1850s and leading up to 1860, our country became very, very divided. And it was divided over two closely related issues. First and foremost, the issue of slavery. The northern states believed that Black people should be free. The southern states depended on having Black people as slaves in order to produce their agriculture and their cotton and their wheat. They needed the inexpensive use of slaves for their economy. So if you were to ask the question, what caused the Civil War? Someone from the North would say it's about slavery and the need to end it once and for all. But at that time, if you would ask somebody from the South, what was the reason for the Civil War? They would give a different answer. They would say the reason for the Civil War was states' rights, the right of a state to decide for itself whether it was going to have slavery or not, and not to have the central government make these decisions. So the Southerners would describe the Civil War as the war between the states and a war about the states' rights. Northerners would say it was a war about slavery. Historians generally agree that it was a war, in the end, about slavery.
So basically, it was a war between the white people and the Black people, we can say.
No, that's a good question. And actually, no, I understand your question. The people fighting on both sides were mostly white people. There were some Blacks that were hired into the Northern Army, which was called the Union. I'll use the term the Union and the Confederacy. The Southern states called themselves the Confederacy, or the person who lived in that was a Confederate. The Northern states referred to themselves as the Union, meaning the country together, holding the country together. But the people fighting were white people mostly. The people in the South were fighting for the right to hold on to slavery. The people on the North were fighting to give Black people the right to be free. But it was mostly a war among white people.
So we can say that this was a war of the basic human rights.
Yes.
We can say.
Yes.
Okay, I got it.
Yes, exactly right.
Okay, my next question is that, as you know, that I understand that the southern states broke away from the United States of America to form their own country called the Confederate States.
It's a hard word. The Confederate States of America.
Confederate States of America. What did they break away from the Union?
What's that now?
Why did they break away from the Union? Why the southern states broke away from the Confederate States of America?
In the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s and 1850s, there was a lot of back and forth as to what will happen for these new states that are being added to the country. Will they be allowed to have slavery, or will they not be allowed to have slavery? and there was some compromises as the United States grew westward and added more and more states. And there became a lot of debate as to whether these new states should be allowed to have slavery or not. And it got to the point where the Confederates said, we're done. We're tired of you telling us what we can and cannot do as the country. In 1860, the president was Abraham Lincoln, and he finally said, we have to put an end to slavery. It's got to stop. And the Confederate states, one by one, said, no, we're going to break away. We're going to start our own country. We're going to have our own currency, our own president, our own Congress. And that's what they did. And it was a battle. There was an attack on a Union fort called Fort Sumter in the state of South Carolina, which is in the Confederate States. There was an attack by a Confederate ship on the fort, and that is considered the official start of the war. That was in 1860, and the war would not end until April of 1865. So basically, the war lasted 5 years.
So the trigger point of that incident was a trigger point of that war.
Yes, that started it. But many people, many historians will say it was inevitable. This was, it was just becoming such an explosive issue. And it was absolutely the closest that the United States of America ever came to separating permanently into two countries. We came very, very close. At the start of the war, the Confederate troops were winning most of the battles. The Union troops in the North were losing most of the battles. There's all sorts of reasons for that, not the least of which is we had some bad generals who were not very good at military strategy. But over time, the Union had more resources, it had more ammunition, it had more better supply trains and ways to get food and ammunition to the troops. And eventually, the Southern troops, the Confederate troops, they ran out of money, they ran out of food, they ran out of ammunition, and the Union troops just ultimately wore them down.
Why was slavery so important for the southern states that they were willing to leave the Union and start their own country to protect their institution?
In the North, there was a lot more industry. There were a lot more factories and manufacturing. And so the economy didn't need slaves. In the South, it was mostly an agricultural economy based on planting of cotton and wheat and corn and sugarcane and things like that. And they depended on cheap labor. Slaves were relatively cheap. You had to feed them, but you didn't really have to pay them anything. But if you had to pay people to do the farming, a lot of the Southerners felt that they could not make a financial go of their livelihoods, and they would go broke. So they needed cheap labor in order for the Southern economy to succeed. So it really was an economic issue as much as anything else. And there was also this strong, fervent belief that the black man was inferior to the white. That they absolutely believed that there was a difference in fact, there was a court case that basically considered that blacks were considered 3/5 of a human. So they were not quite an animal, but they were not quite the same as a white man. They were like 3/5. So they viewed black people as property, not as human beings. This is, by all accounts, the worst, most shameful period in American history. We are a country of many great things, but one of the great embarrassments and tragedies and shames of our country's history is how we have treated black people throughout our history. And even though the Civil War resulted in ending of slavery officially, we still have discrimination and prejudice against black people to this very day. Some 160 years later, we still have widespread discrimination and racism in our country. There are parts of the South where racism is still stronger today than you could imagine, even though the Civil War ended in 1865.
You're saying that the basic problem was that the southern states were having some economic and materialistic interest. The slavery was in their interest that if they lose the slaves, they will lose the economy. You can say.
Right, right. The plantations would collapse. All these wealthy white landowners would potentially lose their businesses and lose their wealth. And, at that time, blacks didn't have much say in society, women didn't have much say in society, and even working class white people didn't. It was the landed, wealthy, the rich white Southern landowner. That's who controlled the power. Absolutely.
Next question is that is it true that many families had sons fighting on both sides, with one son fighting for the Union Army, and another son was fighting for the Confederate Army?
Yes, that's absolutely true. Especially, excuse me, especially places like border states, the states that were sort of along the edge of the North and the South, like the state of Virginia was a state where, at the northern edge of Virginia was Washington, D.C. That was the nation's capital. It was named after George Washington, the first president of our country, and the general who led the Continental Army to victory over the British. So Washington, D.C. was essentially a northern city, but it was right at the edge of Virginia. So there were families that lived in D.C. and one son might serve in the Confederate Army, and he might have a brother serving in the Union Army. The Civil War was the war to determine whether we were going to be a nation of of freedom and equality, or at least aspire to it, or whether whether we were going to turn against that. The Declaration of Independence, sort of our founding principles document, declared that all men are created equal. Now, we've never lived up to that, but this war was really about, are we going to live up to those values? Are all men created equal or not? It was the bloodiest war in American history. I'm going to read to you. The American Civil War had more casualties and more fatalities than any other war in American history. In fact, you could combine all the deaths from military conflict and disease and things like that in all of the other wars: the Revolutionary War, World War I, World War II, the Vietnamese War, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War. Add all of those deaths together, and they do not add up to as many people who died in the American Civil War. Roughly 620,000 Americans are believed to have died either from combat or from disease or illness as a result of the war. So well over 500,000 Americans died in the Civil War.
Well, that is a large number of the people who died.
Yeah.
And I understand that initially the Confederate Army won many battles, and it appeared that they would win. What changed to cause the Union Army to ultimately win the war?
It really came down to, I think, who could outlast who. You are right that the South won many initial battles. They had better military strategy. They were highly motivated. They were terrified about losing their lifestyle and their way of life. But over time, the Union Army had better clothing, better food, more military supplies. They replaced some of the incompetent generals with better generals. And eventually, I think really in the end, they outlasted the South. This war went on for a long time, 5 years. And this is there's only been one other time since the Civil War that there's ever been an attack by another country on the United States. And that was December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacked Hawaii, our naval port called Pearl Harbor. With that exception, there has never been a war fought on American soil since the Civil War. And in the end, the Southern states just ran out of supplies and troops and food, and the Union just overwhelmed them. The Union, there was more wealth in the economy of the North than there was in the South, and the South just wore out. most historians, almost all historians, will say that it's a very good thing that the war ended with the Union winning. Um, who knows what this would be like if the South had won, if the Confederacy had won. My guess is at some point slavery would still have been abolished, but it might have been many, many decades before slavery was abolished. But I think eventually, even even as racist as the as the white people who in power in the South, I think at some point they would realize you cannot continue to justify slavery. But the war expedited and accelerated that.
And why is the Civil War considered to be such an important war in the history of the United States? And what do you think that afterward, in which sense did the United States change?
Well, this war was a war to determine whether a democracy, the way we had created this experiment in 1776, whether it could really endure or not. We had never been tested as a country like this ever before. The United States, both its greatest strength and in some ways its greatest weakness, is its diversity. Our country is a country of immigrants. With the exception of Native Americans, everybody came from somewhere else. All the Americans, other than the Native Americans, came from Europe. They came from India. They came from China. They came from all over. They came from Pakistan. And this war tested the concept, could we be a nation as one or not? And an interesting thing, before the Civil War, when you would talk about the United States, they would say the United States are, meaning it was this collection of many different states. Now we talk about the United States is singular, meaning we now see ourselves as one nation, not a bunch of these states that are all kind of primarily focused on themselves. Um, it was really quite an important war, a horrible war, but one I think that had to be fought. And one of the sad things is that the war ended. The Confederate States surrendered on April 9th, 1865. Abraham Lincoln had saved the country, saved the Union, and declared, and I think it was the 13th Amendment, the right for black people to be free and no longer be enslaved. And that was passed just days before the end of the Civil War. 6 days after the end of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. He was going to a theater to watch a show. This was the first time he was able to relax in years. His whole presidency had happened during the war. There's no president that's had to deal with more difficult circumstances than Abraham Lincoln. None. No other American president. And so finally he had achieved peace. And 6 days later, a Southerner who was very pro-Confederacy, very pro-slavery, very anti the Union, came up from behind Lincoln in his private booth and shot him right here with a revolver. And Lincoln died the next morning. They did catch the assassin. I think like the next day they caught him and arrested him, and he was tried and convicted, and I'm sure he was executed. But it's very sad that Abraham Lincoln saved our country. A lot of people, a lot of historians will believe that Abraham Lincoln was the greatest president our country's ever had. Most historians agree, and he only lived 6 days before he was tragically killed. So it was a huge period of mourning and sadness for our country.
That was too sad to listen about Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
And I think so. He's considered as one of the greatest presidents in the history of America.
Yeah.
And my last question is: still there are some movements or groups, or you can say organizations, which are still in the opinion that the states should be free from the federal the system, and there should be again slavery system in the country.
I definitely think there are people who are racist, um, and white supremacists who believe that whites are better than blacks. I don't think anybody really is suggesting that blacks should be slaves. There are certainly some racist people who may think that blacks are somehow inferior, but I don't think anybody really thinks that blacks should be slaves. But it doesn't matter. These are horrible people. Anybody who thinks that one race is superior to another, or one religion, the people of one religion are better than the people of another religion, in my opinion, these are horrible people. And these are people who are not enlightened. These are people who are not living the values of our country and our founding fathers. Our country is a great country, but we have a lot of challenges in trying to heal as one nation. There's a lot of people in our country who cling to some very outdated views. There are definitely people in some places who will quietly say they wish the South had won the war. They wouldn't say it publicly, but they might say it privately among their friends. But I think our country is blessed that the war did end the way it did, with victory for the Union, and the Confederacy collapsed and returned to the Union right after the war. So the Confederate States of America lasted for about like maybe 3 years or 4 years before it dissolved, and they returned to the Union.
There were very interesting facts which I have learned from you today, and I really think that the Civil War was really a point from where the United States of America turned into a biggest democracy of the world.
Yeah.
And thank you, Tim. Uh,
Yes.
it was
Hey.
a great session for me.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Again, I'm not a historian, so it's possible that I got a couple of my facts off just slightly, but for the most part, what I shared, I can assure you is essentially the way things were, and it will always be remembered as the most important war. It was the war to determine whether our democracy experiment could survive or not, and thank God it was able to survive. Well,
One more thing I was thinking about, that the Americans have fought the war with the invaders and they won, and they have also fought a war within themselves to eliminate the evils from inner side. So you have eliminated the evils from outside and as well as from the inner side. So I think so you are a perfect nation.
well, there's a lot of wars that we have gotten ourselves into that we should never have gotten into, or should have gotten out a lot sooner. We were in Afghanistan for like 20 years. It was the longest war ever for the United States, 20 years in Afghanistan. And most people would argue that our reason for being there, you could make an argument that there was a reason why we invaded because of Osama bin Laden and all that, but that reason ended many, many, many years ago. So, but that's a whole nother topic for another session.
Yes, in the next session we will have the topic of the American wars, which were fought by America in the other states or in other parts of the country of the world.
Yes, yes. All right. Well, thank you very much. That wraps up this episode of Across the World. And thank you very much, Hamad, for your excellent questions. And we'll see everybody again in another episode soon. Thank you, everyone. Bye bye.
Thank you, team. Bye.